You are live.
Oh
And
my,
give me give me just a minute in order to share it. We are live. Yay. And I will tag you guys in.
oh my goodness. Going live for the first time. I made it.
Really? Phillip, you haven't been live before?
Not on Facebook, no.
Wow. Okay, so yes, I'm honored. So you are live on Facebook, on my personal page. You are live on the you are live on Faith in the Valleys page and my YouTube page as well.
Okay.
So while I'm getting this set up, why don't we go around? Let me do this first. My name is Tony McNeil. I am a community organizer with Faith in the Valley. And so we're spread throughout the entire Central Valley, which is pretty awesome. So we take up space. San Joaquin County, Stanislaus County, Merced County, Fresno County, and Kern County. Um, we organize in three huge areas. One is immigration, the other one is restorative justice, and the other one is housing. And so today we wanted to, we've been doing a lot of work in regard to civic education. And today we wanted to really lean in to some conversation around housing. And what we want to do is we're going to go back and we're going to talk about some of the history of housing and redlining. We really need to just kind of lay out, just kind of a clear foundation and a picture. And so the only way that I can do a thing is to pull on people that I know, are well versed. So I'm hanging out with Phillip and Janine and Asante today, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves. And while you guys are introducing yourselves, Janine, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go to Phillip and then to Asante. I'm going to do some technical stuff really quick.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Elder Tony, for putting this together. My name is Janine Nkosi, and I'm a regional organizer with Faith in the Valley. I'm also I teach sociology in the Department of Sociology at Fresno State. And I think this is an important conversation for a lot of reasons, but one in particular is that when we're organizing and trying to affect change around housing and what we see like currently happening across the Central Valley and across California, across the nation, like there's so many problems, and oftentimes folks individualize that. The explanations that people arrive at when they see people are unsheltered or they see people are living paycheck to paycheck and trying to struggle to make ends meet, or when they see people, in like eviction court, they explain how individuals are in the situation that they're in by attributing it to individual choice, individual merits, and there's a much longer, deeper history that is systemic and it's structured and it's like tied to laws and policies and practices, and it's important for people to just be able to know like those connections that, how did we get to the place that we're in. The other reason why I think this is an important conversation, and I'm really happy to be here, is that when we are thinking about like how do we change the problems that we're confronted with, where we have like an enormous amount of people who are being evicted and rents continue to increase, and wages and stuff are kind of like staying the same, but cost of living is going up. We can arrive, I think, at better solutions that can be transformative if we put things into a historical context. So I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate you, pulling us together and just having a conversation. I'll pass it over to Phillip.
Yeah. So my name is Phillip Merlo, and I'm a historian and educator in Stockton, California, and I'm the director of outreach, visitor services, and education at the San Joaquin County Historical Museum, and also very deeply affiliated with Little Manila Rising. Um, I currently, yeah, I've published a lot of articles on segregation in Stockton in academic journals, and also a lot of articles on Stockton history more broadly, and a lot of cultural outlets in Stockton. And I'm currently in the process of publishing a book on the history of segregation in Stockton. I think the nature of the current crisis in the Central Valley, but also across the United States, is deeply rooted in policies and the evolution of policies over time throughout the 20th century, and specifically tied to a lack of planning and in some cases real malice towards different communities, and so or ignorance of them in some cases. That's that's why I'm here. I'm happy to learn and share, and I'll pass it over to Asante.
Thank you for having me. My name is Asante Nkosi. I am originally from Fresno, California, but I live in the Bay Area now. I go to law school at UC Hastings Law, and so I'll be graduating in May. And right now I'm writing a paper, and it's surrounding redlining and racist housing policy in Fresno, and in the Central Valley. And so I'm excited to be here.
Super. Okay, so I want us to just really dive in and okay, housing. Housing is an issue. It is huge. We have an enormous amount of people that are homeless, especially in the San Joaquin County. So I guess what I want to start off with is the question is why? Why is there such a shortfall of housing? I mean, I know that this is a huge list, right? So that's a huge ask. But I'm wondering, if the history of redlining, if the housing issue, if there's a connection between gentrification, the history of redlining, all of that, is this all tied into what we see today? So that's my first ask.
So the short answer is yes, right? 100% yes. One of the space, I'm just going to jump right in here, but then I definitely want to turn over to our two historians. One of the things in one of our spaces, we are doing housing justice circles. Community folk and university folks are coming together in these shared spaces and doing exactly what you're asking us and inviting us to do today, Elder Tony, which is to learn together, learn about our own housing story, learn about this long, deep history of housing, learn about what's the current state of housing, and then develop a vision, a North Star vision for how we can transform it. And so one of the things that we noticed is that the entryway into a lot of our housing conversations are with redlining and racially restrictive covenants and the things that we're going to talk about today. And one of the things that we're trying to correct, and I know we're not going to do a deep dive into all of this, but I think it's important for us to start with the theft of land, at least as a place to acknowledge that land theft is the beginning, the genocide of Native people, the theft of land of European settlers when they came here. That's kind of the entryway that we need to at least lift up in this space, even though we're not going to unpack that. And then, that takes us into things like property rights and who was allowed to own land in this country as we know it, the United States today. But who were the people that were allowed and able to own land? Who were writing the laws and devising, how we were parceling up and using literal violence and force to steal land from indigenous and people who were here, right? Millions of people were here that were living on this land. And I think it's also important, like what we're trying to also think about is like the relationship of indigenous people to the land is fundamentally different than European settlers that come here and devise laws and policies and practices, like a legal system in order to take the land. The relationship with indigenous folks to the land is one of like a mutually beneficial, a mutually, relationship where indigenous people's ideology is one of stewarding the land, not of owning the land. No one owned the land. It was land is a teacher, land is a giver, land is something that you have a mutual relationship with. Another part of like erasure from like the history of housing is when we think about the Mexican folks, that were living, the Chicanas that were living on the land before the border crossed over after the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that then, makes the folks that are here citizens of, the country that we call the United States today, and grants them entitlement to the land that they have entitlement to, but then a series of laws and policies and a system is devised in order to dispossess and steal that land as well. And so anyway, I just wanted to like lift up a couple of those pieces, like in history, as we think about like the on-ramp to how we talk about like the history of housing and land use in the United States.
So do we know who the land belonged to?
Yeah, belong to all the indigenous tribes and people that, were the original peoples of this country. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Feel free, Phillip. And I mean, one other thing is, I'm sorry, just this last piece to say is that who could have property rights were white men, were slavers, right? These are the people who were deciding what the rights were going to be to the land. So there's like that whole history, right? Before we even get to the New Deal and we get to the, the FHA and we get to redlining and those pieces that I just think are an important thing for us to acknowledge and lift up as we kind of set the stage for having a conversation about housing and how we got here.
Awesome. Phillip or Asante?
Yeah. Sorry, I've never actually had a conversation like this in this format.
I know.
Like I'm not sure. It's like, okay, yeah. I mean, I think that the people of our land, they were the Yokuts, and to an extent in San Joaquin County, the Miwok, and especially near Stockton, a little bit less so for the further south you go as it gets hotter. But San Joaquin County was probably the most densely populated place in North America outside of the Valley of Mexico when the Spanish came. And, you're talking about a lot of indigenous deaths due to disease and due to conquest, right? And I think that what happened in particular is that due to the totality of genocide, right? The completeness of what happened, right? Especially in San Joaquin County, there are very few indigenous people in San Joaquin County today. There has very much been an ethos in the community that develops land and property rights, et cetera, that there's no limit to how much you can build on the land and transform the land, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's going to frame a lot of the conversations that I'm going to have later, or a lot of the things that I can contribute later. I think that on top of that, there's also, by the 1870s. And I don't know, your original question is like, why do we have a homelessness
Yeah,
crisis?
yeah.
By the 1870s, it became very common to implement restrictive housing covenants and other systems, that very much varied by locality, whether they were ordinances or unofficial boundaries, but basically creating different, they would refer to them as colonies, right? So that you would have a Chinese colony on Mormon Slough in South Stockton. So the first Chinatown was on Mormon Slough near Hazleton Street, further south, right? Or you would have a Lebanese colony or an Armenian colony, or as they would refer to it at the time, a Negro colony, right? And so segregation was baked into the housing system, right? The idea of segregation is part and parcel with the American system of urban planning, because a lot of the American system of urban planning, it goes back 300 years, really, into the, prior to the American, War of Independence. A lot of it had to do with creating order and creating economic order using property rights, right? And of course, people of color, with very few exceptions, until the end of Jim Crow segregation, had a very difficult time owning land in this country, right? And I'll stop there. I mean, I have a lot to add with regards to the last 50 years. I don't know if we want to build up to that. So,
I mean, Asante, did you want to add anything to this piece part?
I think everybody. I think both Phillip and Janine both covered everything. So we can move to the next question.
So and this is, now I'm asking questions because I'm learning as you all are sharing and talking. And so, Phillip, there was something that you were saying in regard to as you were talking about the colonies historically of the different communities. Then what that's telling me, because I was born in 1969, so and I'm a native of Stockton. However, historically, I had no idea that there was such diversity here in our community.
Well, it's a tricky question, because the diversity of Stockton ebbed and flowed, right? And so, as recently as 1980 or 1989, even, Stockton was a majority white city. But there have been periods of time, especially in the 1920s, the 19 teens, for a brief period, the 1960s, where Stockton was definitely not a majority white city. And a lot of that has to do with agricultural flows and agricultural labor forces immigrating in and out of a city. So, for example, in 1920, Stockton had the largest Japanese community in the country, by a lot, actually. But, by some estimates, about half the city was Japanese. And over time, a lot of those communities purchased land, especially in the Delta or near Lodi or Linden. And as a result, the community became less and less Japanese. And then, of course, the internment took place, and the Japanese community was dramatically dispersed from San Joaquin County, right? And around, over that course, as the Japanese community left the workforce and became more of, a capitalist class of farmers, you saw a dramatic influx of people from the Philippines, and then later from Mexico, right? And so, when it comes to this diversity, it's critical to tie it to the economics, the economic regime that exists in the Central Valley, which is, industrial scale agribusiness and exploitation of the land. And then, of course, when you get into the Kern Basin, there's also oil. We won't even that's a long story, a long conversation. And then there's also the further you get to the Delta, a lot of logistics, right? A lot of trucking, warehousing, etc. As a result, because of that, you have an economy that is completely dependent on low-wage labor. And that will become incredibly important to think about, because when you have an economic regime that's predicated on having a large workforce of low-wage labor, whether that's in warehousing, whether that's in canneries, whether that's in boxing plants, whether that's on the farm, right? That's going to have a huge impact on your urban planning, right? And it's going to have a huge impact, going back to what I was already talking about, on how, not necessarily urban planners that work with cities, right? But how developers, again, thinking about this in a capitalist space, which of course, until the 1970s, most developers in this country were white. How developers thought about economic opportunity, right? And so, whereas in a place like the Bay Area, you see a lot of, over the past 50 years, a lot of development that has targeted people of high wage labor, of tech professionals in the Central Valley, especially in the arc between, basically Modesto, Los Banos, Modesto, Stockton, Elk Grove, West Sacramento, and then, curving back towards Vallejo and Suisun City, and Fairfield, and Vacaville. The industrial housing regime has been predicated on providing housing to farm laborers and logistics workers. I would say that if you go and look at every single business plan for every single major development since late 1960s, in the Delta Valley, as I refer to it, as opposed to the San Joaquin Valley of Fresno, or the Kern Basin of Bakersfield, very different economic regimes there. You have seen basically a trend and a policy of constructing homes that can, in some way, shape, or form, be sold at a profit to people of color, right? With the exceptions being white flight neighborhoods, right? And so, you've got this dichotomy where you have neighborhoods that are designed to bring white communities away from communities of color, and then you have communities that are designed and built primarily to provide very strong transportation chains to workplaces, right? And that's why you see the types of developments you see in the United States today. I'll leave it there. I can wax poetic, but talk about this for a lot, especially with regards to Stockton, Lodi, Modesto, and Merced, and Los Banos. But
yeah, and I appreciate all that, and I'm over here listening, and I'm just thinking about how it connects so much back to when we think about the relationship, to land and like capitalism. And so, right, when we're thinking about that the land is privatized now, it's been, it's something that folks can buy because there's natural resources, right, that people can extract for profit. It just ties to so much, I think, like that history, right, of capitalism, and how the relationship, I think, to European settlers coming, and all the systems that we've devised are tied, right, to that system of capitalism and like profit and privatization. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about as I hear Phillip talk and lay out, the history about like the economic regime, and how like in the Central Valley, we look and we see that we have so many people of color who are occupying like low wage, positions, and we think about like the history of ag, you can't separate that from the history of who was able to own, right, the land and like, you know what I mean? From like that's literally like the foundation that everything is built on top of. So I don't know. I just think that's kind of what's like going through my head as I'm listening to Phillip and thinking about like, how did we get here? You can't untangle that from racism, right? And how white people historically and today have profited and benefited from the systems and structures that were literally created by white men, right? From like that's the foundation. And then you can't untangle that from capitalism and the ideology and the system of privatizing and allowing folks to own land. And I want to invite like Phillip, because there's a lot that I don't know that I'm trying to learn about, like land grants, right? Earlier when I was saying about like people who were citizens of the Republic of Mexico, right, at that point in history, like thinking about how their rights to the land were challenged by other settlers, white settlers, like coming into the area, and then also like the public domain, how that land would either be given to white settlers that were coming, or that land would be taken and put into like a public domain. And then public domain was just the US government's way of then granting that land to other white men, right? And so anyway, if you could talk a little bit about, or bring Asante, and I don't know, like, I just think that history is so important, to like the Central Valley in particular, and like, how did we get to, like this point? Yeah.
Oh, where did Phillip go?
Oh,
Probably bad connection. There we go. Yeah. Sorry.
I entered the chat because I got a red box, and I was just like, and then I tried to leave the box, and it took me out of. Yeah. So I can answer your question. Yeah. So it's interesting. So there's actually there are a couple of phenomenal books written. In fact, one by a CSU Fresno professor. It's published with MIT Press. I think environmental something or other. It's been a while since I read it, but basically in the Central Valley in 1828, 1829. So before there were any Anglophone speakers in this area, there was a massive malaria epidemic, a pandemic, essentially. And roughly between the King River and Sacramento, you're talking about 90 to 95% mortality.
My God.
Yokuts and Miwok peoples of this area.
Oh my God.
North Delta, it was an incredibly densely populated indigenous community. Because of the natural bounty of this land, right? And because for centuries, for about 1,500 years, the Yokuts and their ancestors had cultivated this space into an incredibly productive landscape for them, right? And there's a lot of the land was incredibly healthy from a lot of ecological standpoint, perspectives, but also, and it was incredibly productive. And so that malaria pandemic completely wiped out the area. And because malaria is not necessarily native to California, right? We know that was actually brought to the California region by Spanish conquistadors and also by the missions, right? Mm-hmm. And so the land grants in the Central Valley were, for the most part, unpopulated as compared to the coast, right? So on the coast, you had places like the Monterey Basin, the San Francisco Bay, the area near San Simeon and Cal Poly, near San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, incredibly well populated by this California elite, right? Whereas in the Central Valley, actually, they had a hard time getting people to take land, right? And so, like the Mexican and before that the Spanish authorities struggled actually with finding people who were willing to take land because of this malaria, right? This that had been brought over, another legacy of European imperialism and colonization of the Americas, right? And so what happens is in the 1840s, or no, late 1830s and the early 1840s, a series of grants were given to essentially what you would refer to today as like land speculators, investors, right? People that didn't live there, lived in Monterey, San Francisco, or San Jose.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them were either from Mexico City originally or Guadalajara, or alternatively, they were in Stockton's very particular case. They were Charles Weber, right? Who was actually a Mexican citizen. His legal name was Carlos Merlo Weber.
Really?
So, and of course, he was a Catholic, right? And he was a German Catholic, and definitely a very peculiar history there. And interestingly enough, even though you're thinking if you have 90 to 95% mortality of indigenous peoples in this area, because the Delta Valley, the area between Modesto and Sacramento, was the most densely populated area of the Americas outside of the Valley of Mexico by indigenous peoples. We have the archaeological evidence to prove that.
Mm-hmm.
You're still talking about thousands of indigenous people. And interestingly enough, in Stockton in particular, for about 20 years after Weber founded Stockton in 1848, the community was very tolerant and accepting of indigenous communities. In fact, the street we now refer to as Grant Street was actually Chief Jose Jesus Street. Actually named after, because Charles Weber had a very good relationship with the Yokuts Miwok chieftain of or leader of the Delta, basically from Modesto to the boundaries of Elk Grove. And that relationship was incredibly strong. And when Chief Jose Jesus was murdered by a Union soldier near Angels Camp I think in 1851, it was a body blow to indigenous, Anglo relations, largely because Jose Jesus had been very much a broker of peace between the two communities. And Weber was able to maintain that peace for about 10 years. And unfortunately, due to what essentially became just this massive influx of American settlers after the gold rush. So a lot of people who came, after the gold rush because they were looking to invest in agriculture, right? And this capitalist regime of land extraction, which in this area was predominantly wheat at the time. You started to see, basically, as the size of the community expanded, there were other models of relationships with indigenous peoples, right? And so John Marsh, who is very famous, there's like Marsh Canyon, Marsh Creek, a lot of Contra Costa County, he was an enslaver, and he actually enslaved large numbers of Yokuts people in near Antioch, right? John Sutter, Johannes Sutter, as he was, there's a reason that his statue was pulled down, right? He was a very, I'm not someone who really aggressively looks at morality in a historical sense, but John Sutter was an evil man. He, in my opinion, he was incredibly dishonest. He was known for tricking and enslaving by force indigenous peoples, the Miwok and Nisenan peoples of the Sacramento Basin. And he also purchased indentured servants from Hawaii, right? And there's actually a Miwok, labeled a Miwok casino and tribe in the Sacramento area that is actually predominantly ethnically Hawaiian. And it's really fascinating history. And so, when you talk about like the foundation of Anglophone settlement and Anglophone capitalism in this area, it differs from place to place. And even until the 1920s, the Miwok community, or Miwok community, because by the 1890s, the Yokuts and Miwok communities of Central Valley merged as part of a fight for survival, right? And by the 1920s, even into the 1920s, the city of Stockton had a very close relationship with the Miwok tribes in the Sierra Nevada nearby, which is where a lot of those communities became refugees. Okay. Whereas you don't necessarily see that in Sacramento or Antioch. Fresno's very complex. I won't even try to touch on Fresno. And I recognize that it is a different Central Valley there than it is up here. And I don't want to speak on that. And of course, because different communities were in the Delta even, were populated by different communities of white people, right? And this is like a really incredible nuance, is that the white community, the term white is a constructed racial term, right? But not all white communities have necessarily identified as white as their primary identity. Right? And so different areas of the Delta Valley have been populated by different communities. And so in a place like Lodi, which was very much designed and built as what historians increasingly refer to as an agriburb. So like an agricultural town with all the amenities of a big city, right? I mean, Lodi was founded on that principle.
Okay.
And the relationships with indigenous peoples in Lodi were very violent.
Yes.
Right. And that because it was entirely founded as a capitalist enterprise from the very beginning, right? Elk Grove, very similar in that respect with regards to Sacramento, right? Davis, same thing. And what that creates is it creates a patchwork of survivorship, right? And a patchwork of different but similar industrial regimes that have a huge impact on the housing opportunities down the line. Because in a place like Lodi, or there are cities down in Fresno that are very similar, Fresno land, that are very similar to Lodi, and that they're very white, very wealthy, very deeply segregated, with really nice downtowns. I can think of a few off the top of my head. Those communities have never zoned for affordable housing in their entire existence, right? Whereas Stockton, because Stockton always had and still has a Miwok community that lives in Stockton, always had, even though there were very few Californians in this area, always had a relatively large population of Mexicanos, mostly from Sonora, and then by the mid 20th century, mostly from Michoacan, Jalisco. You have your housing shed, as economists or economic geographers would refer to it. You have a housing shed in Stockton where people of color can live.
What does that mean, Phillip? A housing shed?
So most people who work on farms in Linden don't live in Linden. They live in Stockton or the suburbs.
Okay.
Most people who worked in the Delta historically lived in the neighborhood that until it was demolished, the neighborhood that was traditionally referred to as Little Manila, right?
Okay.
Or to a lesser extent, further south of Little Manila, right? And so Stockton and Fresno and Modesto and Merced and Visalia and Bakersfield, although Bakersfield had a different trajectory courtesy of the oil fields, became the housing sheds for these massive agricultural empires.
So is that the low wage waiver? This is in connection to the low wage labor. And so okay.
Exactly, right?
Okay.
Whereas the towns, these agriburbs, or in some cases, they would refer to themselves as agricultural colonies, right? Because they're land. They were weren't subtle about it, right? This wasn't within the culture of American white capitalism. Capitalism is not bad, right? Colonization is not bad, right? And so that's the key distinction to make. You would see higher amounts of wealth, increasingly dense communities of wealth, and as a result, more amenities for community, better park services, better funded park services, better funded school districts. Although Stockton actually had the best school district in the country until 1960. But that's another story. As a result of all of this, you see, and it's interesting, if you look at where indigenous people survived in the Central Valley, it's the cities that became housing sheds, right?
So this is what is so interesting to me, like making this like real connection, right? You're helping us to make the connection that I think is rarely made, or at least in the spaces, the things that I've read or the conversations that I've been a part of, from the indigenous peoples to the like even hearing this language agriburbs. And the common thing that we think about with redlining is white flight to the suburbs, right? But there's even like a connection back to the agriburbs and the agricultural colonies, right? That you're lifting up. I just think it's an important part of like those long, like historical thread that is connected even to this. It's like an evolution, we make progress, but progress for certain groups. Yeah.
I want to clarify because there was a comment that's not quite historically there. So Sonia Herrera mentioned Lodi housed the capital owners, Stockton housed the workers. That's not entirely true, right? So Stockton has a capitalist elite, right? Developers, in the warehousers, the people who own warehouses, and then of course your run-of-the-mill professionals, right? Doctors, lawyers. Who provide services to a variety of clients, right? What is maybe more the case is that in the American capitalist system, of which the Central Valley is a petri dish, you have two very different types of investments, right? From the standpoint of a capitalist, right? Or someone who invests for a living. You have speculative investments, which are buying farmland and creating spaces for an agricultural elite. And then you have metropolitan investments, right? Stockton is a metropolitan city. Fresno is a metropolitan city. They were conceived of by their founders as the metropolitan centers of their regions. And so, and not even necessarily just in American capitalism, but, because I think increasingly a lot of scholars would argue that other parts of the world had capitalism. It just didn't become imperial in scope.
I have a question really quick. What's a metropolitan? What
Center of government, center of commerce. It's where the banks were, right? So like Lodi only had one bank branch until like the 1920s, right? 1930s, whereas Stockton had like 50.
So I have a question too. I'm curious about wanting to connect the speculative, right, land and agriculture of that historical time point to the speculative, like real estate folks that we have now who are like say Blackstone. I think it's called the Blackstone Group, Invitation Homes. Even in the Central Valley, we know of families who have 10,000, a portfolio of 10,000 properties. We've got like corporate land, real estate investors and corporate land, corporate housing entities that are acquiring, right, large portfolios of property for investment and commodity, right, profit. Is this a similar, like, can we make this connection between?
Sort of, it depends on how strong of a connection you want, right? I mean, I think that especially with Blackstone Group, that's a but like with developer or hyper development capitalism in general, if you can make a profit, do it, right? That's the mantra, right? And so I would distinguish between corporations that buy houses, right? That buy, like Blackstone, their thing is that they what they do is that they're vultures in the indies, right? Whereas or some of the big families down in Fresno or Bakersfield, they're going to build a lot of homes very inexpensively on industrial scale. And then in the Spanos case, actually lobby the federal government to make subprime lending okay.
Hold on, wait, stop. Okay, so I'm just my brain, you guys are killing my brain cells right now. Look, Asante.
Well,
I'm with you, Tony.
Yeah, I think let's zoom out and let's go to at least like the title of this thing. You brought up redlining, and you brought up somebody brought up restrictive housing covenants, right?
Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit about why those became necessary, right? Yeah. And what happened there. So, and why and how that affects today.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think we got a little bit off track, but like not building very necessary foundations.
Yes, so, it really was.
And why this creates a dramatic housing crisis, especially in California, in the Central Valley today, is that as people of color, and to a much lesser extent or much greater extent, depending on how you look at it, people from the Mediterranean, so Armenians, Italians, Persians, people from Spain and the Basques, they would move to the Central Valley. These various communities, they would become part of this agricultural workforce. And then over time, as capital accumulated, right? Because over time, agricultural workers can accumulate a lot of wealth depending on where they are and what the landscape looks like. Over time, a lot of these communities developed a lot of wealth, and the divergent pathways had to do with alien land laws, right? Where certain communities were prevented from owning wealth or from buying land, but also by the nature of the land in which they came, right? And so you have a very divergent pathway. I use this example between the Chinese migration flows to the Central Valley, who built the Delta, right? They were the very first non-indigenous or Chicano community here, besides the Anglophone community. And then the Japanese community, which came about 20 years later, where because the Japanese Empire, which was in itself a capitalist state, was willing to lobby on behalf of Japanese settler colonial colonists, right? The Japanese community essentially was able to access pathways around alien land laws that the Chinese community was not necessarily granted, or not necessarily going to be able to access in the same way. It did happen. There were very wealthy Chinese farmers, Qinlong, but the Japanese community today is actually, very integrated with within the agricultural capitalist landscape, right? Mm-hmm. But then there are other communities, especially by the 1920s, you have a large number of Black migrants from mostly northern Mississippi and Arkansas, a little bit from Appalachian Virginia, but mostly from Mississippi and Arkansas, who are coming to this area either to work in agriculture, mm-hmm. or alternatively to work in warehousing or lumber yards or other industrial concerns. And they're being drawn here out of this opportunity because you can accumulate wealth as a worker if you have a strong community backing, right? If you have large associations of people. And what that did is it created a problem for white communities and white people who held social Darwinist views, which social Darwinism is this idea, it's this adaptation of Darwinist thought, survival of the fittest, to justify racial hierarchy, mm-hmm. where different communities were more intellectually fit than others. And that within certain segments of the capitalist community, okay, the white capitalist community, that philosophy, because it's not really a science, it's a philosophy, became to dominate ideas concerning property and wealth. And what this is that the economic value of a person of color was seen as less than a white person, mm-hmm. because of the color of their skin. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that proximity to low value, because people of color were considered low value by some, that would have a negative impact on property values, which is how we get to restrictive covenants, because developers are looking to profit. And so developers with this social Darwinist mindset would include restrictive housing covenants in their properties in certain neighborhoods in order to keep the property value high. Okay, which would force Black, Chicano, indigenous communities who could own land, right? Critical to know, the alien land law affected people from Asia predominantly, right? Those communities were prevented from accessing homes and housing in urban spaces. Most Black people who owned homes in Stockton or in San Joaquin County lived on Roberts Island, west of Stockton, right? And what that did is it created an unequal, fundamentally inequitable system where in cities, people of color were forced to rent de facto, right? Or alternatively, in very few cases, they had to build their own house, right? If they were people of wealth. White communities were then structurally segregated where people of color did not live there. And that was, again, predominantly to maintain this idea of economic property value. And a good example of this and how this plays out in cultural life, because when it comes to property value, I think most people during the day, they don't think about that, right? They're not worried about the person next door to them affecting the value of their house. So Stockton High School was considered the best high school on the West Coast until, for a long time. Beautiful building, first of all. It was a community college, excellent faculty. And of course, it was also Stockton Unified was the second school district in the state to desegregate after SF Unified in 1979. again, fairly progressive in Stockton itself. So what happens there is that as you get more Black people coming to Stockton in the 1930s, because Stockton didn't have a Great Depression. You can look, Stockton's economy never took a hit during the Great Depression.
Wow.
In fact, Forbes, funnily enough, in 1936 referred to Stockton as the city leading the country out of the Depression. What a difference 80 years makes. You know, and what happened is that you had a lot of developers with social Darwinist views, you know, who were building homes in South Stockton, which is predominantly where the Black community was living due to proximity to warehouses, the port, downtown, etc., creating this geography of racially restricted housing covenants that became codified in law in the late 1920s. I should have said the 20s, not the 30s. And what that does is it creates the geography of, like, you know, south of Main Street, the city is relatively low income. East of California Street, the city is relatively low income. And then entered the Federal Housing Administration, right? Which took these local approaches to maintaining wealth and to creating an agricultural industrial regime that very much appears feudalist in appearance, and it becomes codified in federal law. And I'll stop there because I imagine that Asante and Janine know quite a bit about redlining, and you know, we can talk more about that. But there's a lot of things that go into building this, right? You know, redlining doesn't happen out of nowhere. Segregation existed before in various economic, social, and other forms, right? And of course, the divergence here is that, like, there's some working class communities that, due to either proximity to whiteness or whiteness themselves, that were able to access ownership in land, right? And became part of the capitalist class, right? All of your Mediterranean communities. So whether that's the Lebanese community of Stockton, the Greek community of Stockton, the very large Italian community that identifies with Stockton but doesn't really live in Stockton anymore, the Spanish and Basque communities, the Persian community, there's a very large Egyptian Arab community, Coptic community, the Assyrian community of Merced, the Chicano communities, you know, oftentimes very much there's a lot of proximity to whiteness there, especially in communities from Sonora, which dominated this area in the first half of the 20th century. All of those communities could access wealth, right? And that's where the divergence becomes, and that becomes this dichotomy of whiteness and in communities of color that we see today. Because communities of color in the early 20th century, if you referred to someone as a person of color, almost always the idea was that they were Black, right? The idea of being quote unquote colored, right? This racist term, it generally referred to Black communities, right? And there's a dichotomy there that has to be explored. And then the FHA comes in and crystallizes all of this, right? And federalizes it and dramatically increases the scale of the capitalism, right? And so by 1970, you have what I call, and what some historians increasingly call, meta segregation, which is this term, meta meaning like bigger, where the Bay Area, being the center of economic gravity, aka like San Francisco and San Jose, the beltway between the two, the peninsula of the Bay Area, starting in 1970, stopped altogether zoning for affordable housing.
So wait, before we go to 70, before we go to 70, because so when did redline become illegal? Anyone? Asante, Asante, do you know when did they like say it's not legal to do this anymore?
I'm actually not sure. I don't think that. I mean, I think that is. I don't know if there's actually a law that actually outlawed redlining.
1968
1968.
Fair Housing Act was published. It was signed into law by Lyndon Baines Johnson as a consequence of Martin Luther King's assassination.
Yeah, and I think it's important, because it's like, whether or not it's written in the law is one thing, but actually the actual enforcement is another thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of bringing in kind of the, and Phillip touched upon, like the law, the legal aspect of it, and so the way that the law, was originally, or kind of was really black and white, and so it was in like Phillip said, like the proximity to whiteness. So like the law was really looking at, okay, if you're a black, then you were excluded. You weren't going to have access to anything. You weren't going to have, you weren't going to be protected by the laws. You weren't going to be able to represent yourself in court. You were just excluded. And so then when different communities were coming in, the court would look to see, are they like, if their proximity to whiteness is close enough to white, then they would be afforded, certain rights. And that's why a lot of, like, when he had mentioned like large Chicano and Mexican American communities, when the Treaty of Hidalgo and all that had happened, they had literally said, if you want to be citizens, in the United States, you're going to have to be white, and you're going to have to renounce, your identity essentially, and so, and then, other communities, and there's a lot of case law around, a lot of communities coming in and trying to fight and say, oh, well, I'm white, or like Saudi Arabians coming in and saying, oh, well, we're white, but then, but I mean, and because, white folks, or the law, weren't necessarily able to say, y'all were black, they would do different things. Like they would say, because like Arabic folks are associated with being Muslim, and Muslim is, to white folks, is seen as the opposite of, Christianity and Catholicism. So it's like they othered it, and so it was like, okay, because you're Muslim, you're not white, so so you're excluded. Or and then for other folks, who maintained, a Mexican identity, they were able to exclude them by language instead of by race. And so, so that, and that would look like in, jury selections, or, we're not going to allow jurors to be on juries because they speak Spanish, or, and that would, I mean, if you're in a court of law and your peers don't look like you, and they, already don't like you, then the outcome of that, that case is, it's already written before, it even started. So the legal aspect of it all is that the courts have been very silent. They have just been like, they act like their hands are tied, because they say, oh, well, that's the legislature's fault. We're just the ones here to to interpret the law and to make sure that we just follow the law. And so the court has been very complicit in this entire process, from the taking of land, like how Janine has said earlier, to now with the evictions, with voting. I mean, the court has been very complicit and very silent. And part of that is because, I mean, white people make the law, and they want the law to benefit themselves. Yeah, so.
Yeah. It's
I have a quick question too. Is one of the ways that the legal system and the courts have used as a kind of a scapegoat to say that they can't make a ruling or they can't get involved, is because even though you have like the FHA who is backing the loans, right? And so they're making a determination about which mortgage loans they're going to back, which then create less risk, create like, a greater likelihood that people can get loans. I think this is where also they like extend the term of the loan from like about 10 years to like 20, 30 years. So it's like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that they were saying that it was a banking practice. They were saying that it was in the private, like insurance industry, that it was in like lending and mortgage, and not necessarily like a legal practice that
it wasn't. No. Yeah. And that's a key distinction. Yeah. So like you have to look at the, like, but the thing is, and this is what Asante was getting at, I think, is that the court system is designed on a property law system.
Yeah.
Not on a law system that prioritizes welfare of people.
Yeah. I mean,
Good grief.
And so
Hey.
when you have and the exchange of loans or the backing of loans, they're backing capital, right? And capital is transferable with property, right? And so I've actually interviewed the folks. They're both like in their late 90s, but they were basically the guys who worked for the FHA in Stockton, and they had no idea about, at the time, in like the late 30s, 40s, and early 50s, before. So restrictive housing covenants, those were made illegal in 1948 in California, right? And that was the legal segregation mechanism, right? Because those were enforceable by law. They were on property deeds, right? But like these guys, and they were just talking, is just like, basically the way it worked. So you guys have credit scores? You guys all have credit scores, right? I mean, your credit score is redlining. Your credit score is the descendant of redlining in American life. So basically you would come in and like what redlining was, what the FHA resident map was, the map is a map of what's called residential security.
Right.
Right. And residential security is a value. It's a quantitative value that can be determined based off of all these different variables that are arbitrarily come up with by white bankers, essentially, right? The Homeowners and Loan Corporation came up with it specifically. And then those maps were maps of where people with different types of residential security, different levels of residential security, could access a house, where it was okay to give someone who lives in this neighborhood a loan to buy a home, because you can expect the loan to be paid off. And this is where it ties into segregation, because redlining in itself was not, like, the policy itself was not segregation. Is that those maps were defined by racially restrictive housing covenant boundaries, right? And so the more racially restrictive housing covenants you had, aka the wider your neighborhood, the more likely your neighborhood would be green on a map, right? Sonia says, yeah. So I would say it still exists in different forms, in effect. If you look at geographies of credit score, everybody loves to point out like different maps of, overlaying redlining with different things. If we could ever get a geography of credit scores, I guarantee you it would be the exact same map. It would be.
But it's also even like related to zoning, like the way.
Well, yeah. I mean, restrictive housing is zoning.
Well, I mean, like of today, right?
Yeah.
Where you literally are zoning for like parcel sizes of properties, and in those in those same neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods that where predominantly like white affluent people live. They are still zoning those areas for developers to build outward, based on like a parcel size. And if a parcel size is large, then the what do you say, the amount that the property is going to sell for is going to be higher. And then this relates to what Phillip is talking about with the credit score and some of those other practices, right, that are used to determine who is going to be able to live in those properties. And then it's like the subtle things, like for our family, an interracial family who moves over to Clovis, and we move into a neighborhood where it isn't necessarily like a legal practice, but it's a predominantly white, predominantly racist area where folks still to this day see non-white people as less than, as a threat to their good white neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Don't want their children mixing with our children. And so you have all of these like practices that even, so you have right the zoning and the developers and the banks and the credit scores, like all at that level. But then even, kind of like on the individual level and how the schools are complicit when parents go to the schools and say, hey, our children are being, targeted. And we know that they're being targeted because they're Black, because they are, anyway. So, I mean, so yes, to whoever had lifted up, is redlining like, as a practice, like still happening? Yes. And then I even want to ask a question going back, Phillip, to the two, the two folks that you interviewed, and this idea of like it being like separate from the law, right? Redlining as a practice and being like not legally sanctioned, or maybe that's not what you said.
Yeah, so it's complicated. So
because I'm looking at like the Federal Housing Administration, right? They have the underwriter manual.
It's a federal practice.
That right. Yeah.
Federal, and in that sense, it's legal. But the actual activities of, like it was the banks who were doing this, right? Like it wasn't, the FHA didn't tell you that you couldn't buy a house. The FHA was in Washington, D.C., or in our case, in San Francisco. It was a banker. It would be a loan agent. Who,
I feel like that's just splitting hairs.
Well,
it's
not splitting hairs, because it comes down to, and maybe it's splitting hairs in the eyes of a layperson. But what I'm saying is that if you are working for a bank, it's very different than if you're working for the federal government.
Okay.
But if the bank is using the manual of the federal government as the tool that they're using to go out and survey the neighborhoods and determine which of the color codes they're going to attribute to that neighborhood, then it isn't a separate, right?
Guidelines.
Right.
It's a manual, right? So, and
it's a training manual that the people who go out and do the surveying are using in order to make the determinations about what they are making in terms of like the surveying, right, of that particular area, then attaching a color code, green, and just for like folks, right, like we're trying to like unpack this, like green literally meant that those were the least risky, those were rated good, those particular like neighborhoods. And so they were given literally like a green stamp of approval, if you will, for folks who wanted to buy, white folks who wanted to buy property in those neighborhoods. They were secure. So they got like the green stamp of approval, if you will, from the federal government saying that they were going to back it. So, it was not risk. It was less risky for banks and insurance companies, right, to give loans to those people in those neighborhoods because the federal government was going to back or insure those particular home loans. And then red comes in because neighborhoods where you have Black folks, where you have indigenous folks, where you have immigrant communities, where you have ethnic people, ethnic minorities, though in those neighborhoods, those are given a red stop, that we are not going to back. They're the riskiest areas. And so we're not going to back home loans in those particular neighborhoods, right?
So I have a really important then question just to kind of connect something. Phillip, when you were talking about the low wage labor and these areas then being highly or densely populated, there's these Stockton and these other areas being having a high population of low wage labor. Housing then would have at some point needed to be affordable for those populations, high volumes of populations of families and individuals that provide low wage labor. And so now it's not. And when, I guess that's what I'm trying to get to now is, or was it ever?
Yeah, it was. So, I mean, you have to remember that depending on the community, there were different massive gender imbalances. So the Black community was fairly gender equal in terms of large numbers of men and women who were here, whereas the Filipino community or the Chinese community, especially in the beginning, or the Chicano community in the first 30 years of the Great Migration from Michoacan and Jalisco, these communities were predominantly male, right? And so there was a practice of developing what they called residential hotels, which were these large hotels that were downtown, and some of them still exist, where you could live for 5 cents a day, and they would provide you with a meal and a bed for 5 cents a day, right? And so, and this ties into urban renewal in the 60s and late 50s in Stockton and in Fresno, where those neighborhoods were demolished part and parcel, which created the first housing crisis because there were a lot of people who were homeless in the Central Valley in the late 60s. And those communities, they were demolished because of a very long story, but basically because of this idea that people of color and that neighborhoods of color were poor because of where they lived, because they didn't live in homes and houses. And that's a true story. I mean, if you get to the root of the philosophy of urban renewal, that was it. and so by redeveloping the neighborhoods, they could build much nicer neighborhoods and people would be less poor. What happens there is you have this housing crisis of mostly agricultural workers and to a lesser extent warehousing workers and factory workers that is not solvable because of redlining. There is no economic solution on the market to this problem because the housing crisis has completely, been crystallized again because of loan agreements. And so until 1968, which is when the Fair Housing Act is passed, getting rid of redlining, and only as a result of massive rioting in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, you have increasingly large numbers of people on the streets in agricultural areas of the country, not just the Central Valley, Willamette Valley, Yakima Valley in Seattle, or in Washington, places like Texas, the agricultural zones of Arizona and New Mexico, the Rio Grande Valley, right? And so what happens is that as FHA gets, as the FHA becomes the Housing and Urban Development, agency in like the late 60s, early 70s, there becomes a sea shift into how the government starts to fund housing, right? And this becomes, the federal government is going to build places like Sierra Vista or Conway. These are Section 8 housing.
So
right?
they ceased with the plan they ceased with the plan or the thought process that to build housing and home ownership then is the solution to poverty for the poor folks. And
well, yeah.
because of, okay.
Yeah. So there's a transition from redlining to urban renewal to urban, what they call urban housing and urban development, Section 8, and that system that exists today, to this day, right?
Can we say a couple of things about that point before we keep moving? I just wanted to lift up just a couple of things in terms of the idea, right? When people are looking out and poor people of color are concentrated, right, in the housing shed and the red zoned areas. And there's just a couple of things I think are important to say in terms of there were fewer investments, clearly, right? Fewer homes that were built, or properties, right, that were built. And Phillip's like kind of like naming like right, those hotel, like worker hotels that were constructed. They're constructed poorly. There's not enough housing for all of the the people that are there. So you have overcrowding as well. And you just don't have the investments. And so that on the outside creates these conditions where people are looking at, kind of looking from the outside into these communities. And so they're seeing it's kind of like, I don't remember what you use, but it's kind of like this blaming the victim, like blaming the folks who live in these hotels and in these like restricted areas for the deteriorated conditions in which they've been subjected to. But not, so there's that, right? There's like that, so I kind of like explaining it as, like the cultural explanations and right things that
was actually the inverse of that. So
wait, so let me just say this one other thing is that when white people are casting these like explanations, right, of it being about the individuals that are living there rather than it being about the way the system has been structured, they are also already operating under very racist ideas. So it's almost like this self-fulfilling prophecy because you're already holding racist ideas and then looking at a particular group and a particular area, and then your explanations that you arrive to explain what you see is like entangled in all of that. So
it's a bias. It's a bias that is bought into because of a dominant narrative that's already been painted in regard to maybe a population or a community. And so that cynicism, it's easy just to kind of fall into that place with the cynicism. You see it with law enforcement when they're having to go into one area over and over and over and over again. You've already been warned. And so I don't want to get too off track. I'm going to bring us right back. But I remember, go ahead.
Because something Dr. Janine said is definitely not so like the idea behind urban renewal was not that the people made the areas poor.
Oh,
that is not true. The idea behind urban renewal and the philosophy that guided it was that because the buildings had been built poorly and because the neighborhoods were so dense and because they were underserved, that the people were oppressed. And that was the idea behind it. And
just to clarify, I wasn't saying that. There was just something that you had said about people looking at these particular areas and having an ideology that it was people who were responsible. Yeah,
that's how it came off, what you said, or how I perceived it. But what it was, and so the idea was that they would demolish those neighborhoods and rebuild them. Problem is that nobody had the money to rebuild them and nobody wanted to because of redlining. Right. So like they destroyed these neighborhoods, like they destroyed Little Manila, right? They destroyed they destroyed Japantown in Stockton. They destroyed Chinatown. They destroyed Boggs Tract. They destroyed El Barrio del Chivo, right? And the idea was that they would rebuild them better. That's the guiding philosophy of urban renewal. But they never built them. They could never build them because of redlining.
Yeah.
Right. And if you go back and look in city council minutes in Stockton, like, again, the idea guiding all of this in like the late 50s was that they were going to rebuild these neighborhoods in a more equitable way.
Yeah. And
but
I think
couldn't, because they couldn't get loans.
But there's also an important like piece of it is that they're still building, but what they're doing is sprawl. And this is right. Is this like a part of like sprawl and white flight and building up the suburbs? And is this where like a piece of like, I'm not sure where we are on the historic timeline, but like where the GI Bill comes into play and you have these investments in like education and training and housing, importantly, and 98% of those loans that are given right to veterans, 98% of those go to white veterans, and only I think it's like 2%, and maybe I'm a little off on the math, but it's like an overwhelming number, goes to white veterans versus going to Black veterans. And so so there's like that piece, right? And then something, Phillip, you were going to mention something about like Section 8 and public housing. And I'm learning about all this. Some of it was lifted
I have lost audio.
in Rothstein's like Color of Law.
Did y'all mute me? Or did y'all turn my audio off?
We can hear you.
No.
Oh, no.
Yeah, some of it is lifted in the book, The Color of Law, which I just think it's important to name is that in terms of like public housing and those big major investments that we saw from the federal government to build housing, that housing to a large degree was built for white workers and for white people who could actually afford rent, but there just were not enough properties for them to live in. And so I didn't really like know about that part of the history of like public housing. And then when you see people that were originally like these public housing communities or complexes were built up for, when they begin to leave because they have home ownership opportunities, and you have Black folks and people of color who are moving into those public housing units, then you don't continue to see like the investments, you see overcrowding, you see like the deteriorating of those complexes. So
I'm trying to envision it. I'm trying to envision it now just from a practical place for me as a lay person. So, for example, my grandmother, and Phillip, I think in the same space, we talked about this. My grandparents owned their home. My grandmother owned the house, both my grandmothers, one in Boss Tracks and one in Crow Valley. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go there. Yeah. So my grandparents owned. I was born in 1969. I was 5 years old when my grandfather died. My grandmother, when I was 9 years old. So by the time I was 10, her house, she had to sell her house. Mm-hmm. People were coming around. I never forget it because I've never seen her more sad, gloomy, depressed. She had her own garden, her own chickens, her own, all of this different stuff. There was an older neighborhood, but everybody owned their home. And so there was a community I grew up in, the elementary school. I know that there was Spanish speaking people there because I spoke fluent Spanish at 5 years old because of one of my neighbors, and we played together. So I was bilingual, fluent. But everything changed. And there was a freeway that was built, and I had no way of knowing that it was the freeway that I-4, right? Little Manila was destroyed. Boss Tracks was destroyed, where my grandmother's house was. If I can drive down there now, but there are warehouses with gates and a freeway. Overpass, yeah. Through that whole area, she was displaced. My grandmother in Crow Valley still lived there until she died. However, there hasn't been a lot of there are no grocery stores. It's a food desert.
Mm.
Lots of warehouses are out there. Trucks going through the schools are absolutely just no investment in the schools. There was a lot of youth and a lot of teenagers. You don't see a lot of that, in those neighborhoods and stuff anymore. And those started changing when the housing market started getting, crazy and so I've seen some things, but couldn't really attribute the why. Phillip, Janine, Asante, to what was going on in the communities I grew up in. I couldn't figure out the why. And so you guys are starting to connect dots for me, and prayerfully for others as to why there are food deserts, why my grandmother never owned a house again.
Yeah.
Or when she never owned a home. She went from owning her own home to renting, um, this raggedy house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think too. It's like when I don't know that there's not necessarily like a connection, but just hearing Phillip when you were talking about like the hotels, that were created, right, for workers at a particular time, and I'm thinking about like currently in this moment with COVID.
We're going back
And with
home.
the community, and we're buying motels so that we can create like transitional housing, spaces for people who are unhoused. That's just something like I think about, right? And then I also think about, like somebody had asked earlier about redlining and zoning, and how does that kind of play out? How do we see that still to this day? Well, when we think about these motels that are being acquired right now with federal funding, they are also concentrated in the same redlined areas, right? From like historically, we're not talking about acquiring property or building up, public housing opportunities in, the historically like green lined areas, and where, folks kind of like sprawled out to all of those like white suburbs. And so, yeah, just hearing the history to me makes me think about all of the ways that I just see things that are still playing out now. Mm-hmm. And that like hits that foundation, you know what I mean? Like the bedrock of where it all began. It looks different. Yes, things have changed, but those ties like run like a seamless thread in some ways, right, all the way from the very beginning.
And we definitely haven't even touched on the migration from the Bay Area to here, and I mean that's like there's no way to even capture all of this. What I want to say is, and I'm just doing wrapping us up. This is, I know that it's a lot. I know that it's weighty, and it's a lot of having to navigate through history. However, with the civic education component that is needed, we have to do this. There needs to be a deep diving into, and so we need, the historians, Phillip, we need the researchers, Dr. Janine, we need that Asante, the legal part of it, the color of law. Every time you spoke, all I kept thinking about was the color of law. I just didn't want to mention it because God help us, that's a whole nother dive into a whole nother dialogue and conversation. But we need this. And so I wanted to just start off with something that is really broad, in leading us into a series of conversations in regard to some of the history that is surrounding housing, how we got where we are, why is land even important? Santi, were you going to say something? Why land is important, why it's significant, the value of it, why does it seem like when we can't, a lot of folks don't understand, and I'm not expecting us to answer it today, but a lot of community members don't understand. So and we've got to get to a place where we understand what the heck is a community trust fund or a housing trust fund. Why is that even important? How can I, as an organizer, ask people to support, to push, to represent something that makes no sense to them? You know, so you all are some of the closest that I can get to breaking down just the blah blah blah, as I say, to what's really going on. And a thing, and I needed to be able to speak to all folks in the community. So not just Black community and Asian community and the Latino community and I need the white community, all folks, because we're a very diverse community. Faith in the Valley does very diverse organizing, and we've got to educate on all fronts so that the folks that care, that live in Lincoln Village, you know, there are folks that have purchased homes. Like I got Black folks that have purchased homes in Lincoln Village, and they're like, we've arrived, and so then they'll see, somebody never, and that undocumented illegal person. I'm like, I don't understand what's happening. What's the mindset? Because they didn't want you here. It was written inside the bylaws that you shouldn't even technically be here. Why is it Sierra Vista and Western Ranch and all of that? Western Ranch is diverse. Sierra Vista and not Ball's Track, Conway Homes. It used to be an extremely high population of Black population. Now it is not. It is a very low population for Black folks, and it is very high population for the Latinx community.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of movement, a lot of changes and stuff. And so we got to kind of start digging into that, where folks are at. Is redlining still an issue?
Yeah. And I think it's such an important, it's always been important, but right now in particular, with the economic downturn, right, that we're really experiencing because of COVID and so many people's housing like being at stake. And the investments that we just passed a $1.9 trillion federal stimulus. And I can't remember how many billions of that is earmarked for investments in like homelessness and housing. And so we have to have these conversations, and we have to have like a deep, we have to have like the full context of it, so we can reckon with the past and stop perpetuating, right? Kind of like perpetuating the same failed, policies and programs that got us to where we are. So we can push things like social housing that really rival a capitalist system. And we can unpack stuff related to like misconceptions that people have about investments in public housing, because it cuts across like race and class lines. And anyway, depending on how we understand that, will determine to a certain degree whether or not people will support big investments in public housing, right? Yeah.
The people that need to understand it, the language, we've got to figure out how then to ensure that the language barriers are there. And I'm not talking about now, different cultural languages. I'm talking about a language that has been created to actually keep people from the table and being able to be a part of the dialogue. I can't, as an organizer, get folks to support something that they don't understand. I cannot get people to show up to talk about things that they don't understand. And so today, you guys, I learned so much. My brain is blown from all the stuff that I have learned today, period. About the history of our of the San Joaquin County and just the breakdown of it. So I really super appreciate you guys for taking the time and coming in on this.
Thank you for bringing us together.
Sophia, I appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure. So, and I'm back.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, like for real, for real. And what I will do is actually meet with you guys one to one, and then connect with you in order to, because the history is so much, and you're more prone and steeped in this, to figure out pathways, to get us to where we need to go. Because at the end of the day, when decisions are being made and we need the community to be involved, they need to understand. And so I just want to make sure that I'm creating a bridge for them to get that understanding in the best way that they can. So I super appreciate you guys. Thank you for topping time for me today and coming into this space. Asante, I got your email. I'm going to be pulling you into an anti-Black conversation that we're going to be having with a couple of folks in a couple of weeks. So I'll reach out to you on that one as well. Phillip, I'm going to follow up with you. I told Janine I could sit at your feet. I'm like this. For real. And then I have to say, stop. Let me take a break and then come back. Okay. But I would love to even invite you into our Faith in the Valley staff space, or with our housing staff sometime, to just create opportunities for us to learn from our history, from a historical framing as well. And Dr. Janine, I appreciate you always, always, super always. So you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Thanks to the people that tapped in. And I will be sharing this out throughout the rest of the day. So
Thank you, Tony.
I'm gonna log off from our live.
Adios.